Welcome back to France 24. We are live from Paris. The headlines this hour. Royals and world leaders sit side by side and thank veterans on the 75th anniversary of D-Day. The largest seaborne invasion in history involved over 150,000 Allied troops and helped bring an end to World War II. The death toll in Sudan rises following the recent crackdown by security forces. Opposition medics say over 100 people have been confirmed dead, and calls for dialogue from the military council are now going unanswered. And Australia's national broadcaster gets raided over allegations it published classified material. The raid on ABC comes 2 days after an unrelated search on an editor from News Corp. The unprecedented searches have some raising concerns over press freedom down under. Royalty and world leaders pay tribute to veterans as they mark the 75th anniversary of D-Day. The largest seaborne invasion in history involved over 150,000 Allied troops and helped bring an end to World War II. French President Emmanuel Macron paid tribute to 71 French resistance fighters shot dead by the Gestapo, but whose bodies were never recovered.
These Allied forces that were able to unite to liberate us from tyranny, from the grips of the Germans, are the same forces that built the structures of contemporary multilateralism after the Second World War, the United Nations. They avoided repeating the same errors after the First World War with the humiliation of those who were defeated. They instead built a balanced order, NATO, which allows for the protection of Europe, as well as the European Union, which was also born out of that conflict. So I think it's important not to repeat history, but remember what was built after the Second World War.
That was the French President Emmanuel Macron speaking in Caen earlier. Now, at events in Portsmouth earlier today, Queen Elizabeth thanked veterans on behalf of the United Kingdom and the entire free world. Commemorations were attended by the US President Donald Trump on the last day of his state visit. For more on the events in Portsmouth, here's France 24's Bénédicte Paviot reporting.
It wasn't a time for division or recriminations. Her Majesty was accompanied by 15 world leaders, as it was 14 nations then, now 15 since the breakup of Czechoslovakia, who were here. So, of course, the French President Emmanuel Macron, the US President on his third and last day of his state visit, and interestingly and importantly, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. So one of reconciliation, emotion, dignity, sacrifice, and really that message to the young generation: help secure that freedom, don't take it for granted, remember the sacrifice.
Bénédicte Paviot reporting there from Portsmouth earlier. Now, D-Day involved 150,000 Allied troops, and it brought an end to World War II and ended Nazi rule once and for all. Take a look.
In 1944, all harbors are held by German forces. Building artificial ports to deliver soldiers and equipment becomes paramount. More than 150,000 men and 20,000 jeeps are needed by June 6th. The remaining troops and supplies will follow. In a last-ditch effort to defeat Nazi Germany, more than 4 million soldiers stationed in England are expected to cross the English Channel and land on the beaches of Normandy. Omaha and Gold Beach are the main targets. Troops face heavy resistance at Omaha Beach, but push inland rapidly just 20 kilometers away. Operation Overlord, also known as D-Day, remains the largest amphibious military assault in history. To build the artificial harbors that would support D-Day landings, 147 concrete caissons were shipped across the channel and sunk underwater. Steel roadways link them together to form a floating pier, an engineering feat that could support the weight of armored vehicles and move with the tide. According to witnesses at the time, the structure was a floating highway. It is believed Gold Beach was the transit point for 1/4 of all troops and supplies during the war.
Opposition medics in Sudan say the death toll from recent violence, which erupted after security forces raided a protest camp, has risen past 100. This Wednesday, 40 bodies were recovered from the Nile River in Khartoum. Opposition groups have already rejected offers from the military council to resume talks. For weeks, both sides have been negotiating over who should lead the country as Sudan transitions towards a democracy. Earlier, we spoke to Eric Reeve, senior fellow at Harvard University, who told us the violence over in Sudan hasn't yet come to an end. Take a listen.
The first thing we need is an end to the violence. The violence, in fact, continues. I receive almost hourly reports of beatings, women being raped, more murders, excessively humiliating acts directed at both men and women. The rapid support forces, we must understand, are not trained soldiers. They have no military training. They're militia forces, largely Darfurian, and they behave with none of the restraint that should be expected of any military force, certainly one that has essentially taken control of the greater Khartoum urban area. The larger problem is that the military council has exhibited supreme cynicism by calling for renewed talks 2 days after the same council sanctioned this brutal action against civilians in front of Army headquarters. There can be no trust in the words of Al-Baram, the chair of the military council, or for that matter, Lieutenant General Hameti, head of the RSF and deputy head of the council. There's a very short window remaining in which the army might seize control of the situation. This would happen not from the leadership of the generals, but rather the disaffected mid-level officers, majors, colonels, and junior officers who despise the rapid support forces, see them as undisciplined, untrained, and not really soldiers at all. But whether or not there's enough courage and determination on the part of these officers to lead probably battalion-size units against the rapid support forces is an open question. We don't know how many RSF troops there are in Khartoum. Best estimates are 10,000 to 15,000, and General Hameti is not part of the army's chain of command. So he's essentially an army unto himself. Yesterday, notably, Human Rights Watch, unusually for the organization, called for targeted sanctions against the Transitional Military Council. That call for targeted sanctions was echoed by no one, not by the European Union, not by the US, not by the UN, not by the African Union, no one. No one seems prepared to put any real pressure on the Transitional Military Council, even as they enjoy enormous support from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the Emirates.
Mexico's president has received a list of U.S. products which could be slapped with retaliatory tariffs. This if Donald Trump makes good on his threat to impose a 5% tariff on all Mexican imports from next week. Speaking earlier, the U.S. president says he believes Mexico wants to make a deal, but he will go ahead with his threat unless the country does more to control the flow of migrants heading north. For more on this story, we can go across to Washington, D.C. and speak to Pedro da Costa, Director of Communications at the Economic Policy Institute. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. Is this Donald Trump's new go-to strategy? Every time he's unhappy with policies from one country, he's going to threaten tariffs, even if it flies in the face of a trade deal his administration negotiated?
Well, I like to joke that when people like to attribute some kind of grand strategy to the Trump administration, I really like to dismiss that idea. And so I like to say that if Donald Trump gets it right, he's probably making a mistake. And so in this case, I think this is a case of him really overplaying what is a fairly strong hand for the United States. Because, I don't know, it's impossible to get into the man's mind. I don't know what prompted him to do this, if it was Stephen Miller wanting to ramp up anti-immigration rhetoric in advance of next year's election. But as you pointed out, first of all, let me point out the sort of the moronic nature of the president's comments, for lack of a better term, because he says, I think Mexico wants a deal. Well, he's just come to a deal with Mexico. So that makes no logical sense at all. And then, as you pointed out, I think the reason he overplayed his hand is that by going after Mexico in this way, where he's asking for something that Mexico can't give, he's actually lost trust with all of the rest of potential U.S. trading partners. So he's really shot himself in the foot with this one.
Because, I mean, let's just say, for argument's sake, that Donald Trump does go ahead and impose this 5% flat tariff next week. Who's it going to hurt?
Oh, first of all, it's going to hurt U.S. consumers with higher prices. It's certainly going to hurt U.S. farmers, who are, of course, part of Trump's base and are already suffering greatly from even the prospect of trade wars. And now that they're fully raging, it's even worse. And ultimately, you know, it could get worse. It could be a global economy as a whole that suffers. And as you might have seen, markets have gone from being fairly optimistic about the outlook for the economy to, you know, pricing in a fairly strong probability of a recession. And I think one of the reasons for that is what this latest kind of completely off-the-wall move by Donald Trump led markets to sort of come off their own self-delusion that there would be a rapid solution to this trade war, and to actually start to think that maybe this trade war is going to be a matter of years and not months, and perhaps even outlast Donald Trump's own presidency.
Will Donald Trump go ahead, you think, and really impose tariffs on Mexico, given that senators from his own party are not happy with this threat?
I really do not know. I can't make that prediction, but what I can say is, as you point out, that Republican opposition, the fact that it's been so poorly received in global financial markets and that it's scaring so many people, leads me to believe that, and the fact that Trump is a reality TV president who loves to pull victory from the jaws of some kind of defeat that he had engineered, he may, you know, have some last minute, you know, pretend deal with Mexico that gets him back to the table with NAFTA negotiations. But in a sense, the damage is done, right? Because what confidence does it instill in the sort of on the ground trade negotiators and the legislators who are supposed to ratify the deal, that he's not going to change his mind in a couple days and go back to it. So it really drives home the point of just how volatile a presidency via tweeting can be.
We'll see what happens, because we do have the Vice President, Mike Pence, who is meeting with the Mexican delegation today. Pedro da Costa, thank you very much for joining us from Washington, D.C. today. In other news, the offices of Australia's national broadcaster ABC was searched over allegations it published classified material. In an unrelated incident, the home of an editor at News Corp was raided 2 days ago. The recent raids are raising eyebrows down under, with some raising concerns over freedom of the press. Clément Bonneau reports.
The raid began shortly before lunch on Wednesday when 3 federal police officers, along with 3 IT specialists, walked into ABC's Sydney headquarters with a warrant. They demanded access to reporters' handwritten notes, emails, story drafts, footage and passwords, spending 8 hours combing through thousands of documents. The operation relates to an ABC series in 2017, The Afghan Files. It was based on secret military papers that were leaked to reporters, detailing allegations of unlawful killings and misconduct by Australian special forces in Afghanistan. It's the second time police have targeted journalists in 2 days. On Tuesday, they raided the home of News Corp journalist Annika Smethurst after she reported on government plans to spy on citizens' communications. Reacting live on ABC, the organisation's editorial director condemned an unwelcome development.
It's not the Australia I know, for example. I've been a reporter in this country for a long, long time, and it's not what we expect. That's why it feels so unusual and uncomfortable. It should be uncomfortable, and we should stand up and call it out.
News organisations around the world have condemned the raid, the BBC describing it as a deeply troubling attack on press freedom. French NGO Reporters Without Borders, meanwhile, warned the Australian government about, quote, the grave threat it is posing to investigative journalism and the confidentiality of journalist sources.